So I want you to tell the truth by a show of hands. How many of you looked at this morning's text and got just a little more or more than a little worried about the time? No, yeah, you liars. I know what you're thinking. You're thinking, this guy has been known to spend 2 weeks on a single verse. How in the world is he going to cover 7 chapters in one sermon? We should have packed our lunch.
That's true.
I don't blame you for feeling a little distressed. I would too if I were you. So let me set your mind at ease from the start. We will not be here any longer than usual this morning. In fact, we may get out a little early, but I wouldn't hold my breath. The more perceptive among you are likely troubled by a second thought. You've looked ahead and you've seen of what these chapters consist. They detail, in some cases in excruciating detail, the allotment of the land to the tribes of Israel. And you're wondering if I intend to read the whole thing or trace the exact geographical locations that are mentioned. So I want you to rest assured, I have no intention of doing either. I will leave you to read these chapters on your own if you are so inclined. And the back of your Bible likely has a map that can provide you with a pretty accurate depiction of the allotment of the land according to the tribes of Israel. Dale Davis addresses the difficulty of this portion of the book of Joshua with his customary wit. He says, even the most stout-hearted reader of Joshua begins to crumble and nod as he enters chapters 13 to 21. Watching war movies, that's like chapters 1 to 12, always tends to be more exciting than participating in land surveys. That's like chapters 13 to 21. Insomnia naturally thrives on accounts of dry riverbeds or crumbling walls. Somehow, chasing a Canaanite out of the hill country is far more stimulating than plodding over his former land, counting villages and tracing borders. I think he's right. He goes on to suggest our problem is that we are too detached. Insofar as possible, we must see this land distribution as an Israelite would have seen it. So the question is, how would an Israelite have read these chapters in the book of Joshua? They would have read them, they would have heard them as the reading of a will. This is the detailed account of Israel's inheritance over 400 years in the making. If you were receiving an inheritance for which you had waited your whole life, for which your family had hoped and longed for generations and centuries, I doubt whether you would find it dull. I think you would be on the edge of your seat. So the challenge over the next couple of weeks is to see these chapters as in some way related to our own inheritance. There will come a day when all of Christ's enemies are defeated and his church is gathered to him, and our inheritance in the new heaven and the new earth is apportioned out to us. That inheritance will make this inheritance seem like a pittance. Like inheriting an old piece of property that is so run down it will cost more to repair than it is worth. But the church today finds itself in the same position as Israel during that 400-year gap between the promise to Abraham and its fulfillment here in the pages of Joshua. During those long centuries in Egypt and those 40 years in the wilderness, Israel could not see its inheritance. It did not yet possess its inheritance. All it had was a promise. Likewise, for the past 2,000 years and counting, the church has not seen its inheritance. Our enemies are all around. The world, the flesh, and the devil surround us on every side. But we have a promise. We have a covenant. And seeing the Lord's covenant promises to Israel fulfilled in detail in Joshua 13 to 21 gives us the assurance that we too will see our promise fulfilled and that we too will inherit our promised land. In order to see the faithfulness of God displayed in the fulfillment of his promise, we need to go back to that promise and we need to look at it in detail. God first promised the land of Canaan to Abraham in Genesis chapter 12 at Shechem. Genesis 12:6. Abram passed through the land to the place of Shechem, to the oak of Moreh. At that time the Canaanites were in the land. Then the Lord appeared to Abraham and said, "To your offspring I will give this land." Some 25 years later, God repeated this promise to Abraham in Genesis 17. "And I will establish my covenant between me and you and your offspring after you throughout their generations for an everlasting covenant to be God to you and to your offspring after you. And I will give to you and to your offspring after you the land of your sojournings, all the land of Canaan for an everlasting possession, and I will be their God." But the most detailed geographical promise to Abraham comes in Genesis 15, verses 18 through 20. "On that day, the Lord made a covenant with Abram, saying, 'To your offspring I give this land, from the river of Egypt to the great river Euphrates, the land of the Kenites, the Kenizzites, the Cadmonites, the Hittites, the Perizzites, the Rephaim, the Amorites, the Canaanites, the Girgashites, and the Jebusites.'" Here in Genesis 15, we have the broad outlines of the geographic boundary of the Promised Land. It stretches from the Nile River in Egypt, the land of Goshen in northern Egypt, in the southwest, that's its southwest border, all the way to the Euphrates River in the northeast. It's implied that the Mediterranean then will form its western border and that the Arabian desert will form its eastern border. Not only did God's promise to Abraham include geographical boundaries, it also included the time frame of its fulfillment. Also in Genesis 15, "Then the Lord said to Abram, 'Know for certain that your offspring will be sojourners in a land that is not theirs, and will be servants there, and they will be afflicted for 400 years. But I will bring judgment on the nation that they serve, and afterward they shall come out with great possessions. Then they shall come back here in the 4th generation, for the iniquity of the Amorite is not yet complete.'" And so it was. In the latter days of Jacob's life, long after Abraham's death, Jacob took his family and all that he owned down to Egypt in order to escape the famine. To Egypt, where Joseph, his son, ruled as prime minister. There they dwelt in the land of Goshen, and they multiplied greatly. After Joseph's death, though, we read in Exodus chapter 1, their fortunes in Egypt changed, and they became the slaves of Pharaoh. Nevertheless, God remembered his covenant. Exodus 2:23, "During those days the king of Egypt died, and the people of Israel groaned because of their slavery, and they cried out for help. Their cry for rescue from slavery came up to God, and God heard their groaning, and God remembered his covenant with Abraham, with Isaac, and with Jacob. God saw the people of Israel, and God knew." And so God called to Moses when Moses was in exile in the land of Midian, and he sent him to deliver his people from the bondage of Egypt and to bring them into the land of promise so that they might possess their covenant inheritance. And so by means of the plagues, the Passover, and the parting of the Red Sea, God brought his people Israel to Mount Sinai, where he established a covenant with them and constituted them as a nation and gave them his law. A year later, he brought them to the very border of the Promised Land, to a place called Kadesh Barnea. But at that time, they refused to believe God's promise, and they rebelled against his covenant. So God judged that generation, and he sentenced them to die in the desert, but he promised that their children would inherit the land. And so his promise remained. The sin of Israel could not and did not annul the covenant of God. After the death of that unbelieving generation, after the death of Moses, God raised up Joshua to lead Israel into the land of Canaan and to make war upon the peoples of the land and so to possess their inheritance. And that is precisely what we have seen transpire in the first 12 chapters of Joshua. Now, chapters 13 to 21 records the allotment of that promised land to the tribes of Israel. So Joshua 13 to 21 is the fulfillment of Genesis 15. It was quite a journey getting there. But in his own time and in his own way, God proved himself faithful to his promise. He always does. Well, having reached back to Genesis and to the original promise made to Abraham, having traced that promise through the centuries and through the generations as it awaited its fulfillment, what I'd like to do now is to walk through Joshua 13 to 21 in broad outline, and I want to show you how that promise was fulfilled. Then we're going to return and we're going to look at a few particulars from which we can glean some application for the church today. So let's take a few moments. Let's walk through these chapters, looking particularly at how God's promise was fulfilled in Genesis 15. His promise to Abraham in Genesis 15 was fulfilled rather in Joshua 13 to 21. Chapter 13, you can just follow along with me as we kind of just give a very brief overview of these chapters. Joshua 13 begins with a description of the land that remained to be conquered and possessed, which is broken into three main sections. So at this point, there are three portions of the promised land that Israel has not yet conquered. The land of the Philistines in the extreme southwest of Canaan, what is today the Gaza Strip on the Mediterranean Sea down on the way to Egypt. The unspecified land of the Canaanites, that's verse 4, and then the far northern regions in Lebanon, verses 5 through 6. This is our first indication in the book of Joshua that the conquest was not yet complete. Though at this point the Lord seems to be okay with this. As yet, this is not manifested as an act of unbelief on the part of Israel, because it is God himself who pauses the conquest and commands Joshua to divide up the land amongst the tribes of Israel. Look at verse 6 again. I myself will drive them out from before the people of Israel. Only allot the land to Israel for an inheritance, as I have commanded you. Now, therefore, divide this land for an inheritance to the 9 tribes and half the tribe of Manasseh. As we will see later, Israel failed to believe this promise in verse 6, that God would drive out these peoples from before them. At any rate, the remainder of Joshua 13 details the inheritance of Israel that lies east of the Jordan River, which the tribes of Reuben, Gad, and half of the tribe of Manasseh had requested and received from Moses in Numbers 32, on the condition that they pass over before their brethren and help them to conquer the land of Canaan, as we read in Joshua 1, 12 to 18. So that's Joshua 13, the command to allot the land and the inheritance allotted to the eastern tribes of Israel. Joshua 14 begins the allotment of the land west of the Jordan River to the remaining 9.5 tribes. There are 3 points worth noting in this chapter. First, the inheritance, you'll note, look at verse 2. The inheritance was divided by lot, which means that it was the Lord who divided the land. Not Joshua, not Eleazar the priest. The Lord himself is distributing the land as he sees fit, because, as Proverbs 16:33 notes, the lot is cast into the lap. In other words, humans cast the lots, but its every decision is from the Lord. So the inheritance which each individual Israelite received, they received as a direct gift from the Lord himself. There could therefore be no grumbling that this allotment was not fair or that one inheritance was better than the other, because the Lord divided the land as he saw fit. Second, for the third time now, the author mentions that the tribe of Levi received no inheritance amongst the tribes of Israel, at least no inheritance of land, but only cities and the pasture lands that surrounded those cities. We'll discuss next week why that is when we look at chapters 20 and 21. All you need to know today is that this is because Israel was chosen to be the priestly tribe, and their inheritance from the Lord came in a different form than land. In other words, the tribe of Levi is not being left out in these chapters. In fact, as we will see next week, they are honored above their brothers. Third, yet there are still, even though Levi doesn't receive an inheritance, there are still 12 tribes that receive an inheritance in Israel. 9.5 east of the Jordan and 9.5 west of the Jordan. Well, how's that? 9.5 and 2.5, that's 12, and Levi is 13. I thought there were 12 tribes in Israel. Well, if you remember your book of Genesis, Joseph had two sons, Ephraim and Manasseh, and each received an inheritance within Israel, as promised in Genesis 48:5. Half of Manasseh settled east of the Jordan, half settled west of the Jordan. So 12 tribes received an inheritance of land, and the tribe of Levi received the priesthood as their inheritance. The remainder of Joshua 14 then details the inheritance that was granted to Caleb as a reward for his faithfulness back in Numbers 13 at Kadesh Barnea, when he and Joshua alone brought back the good report and attempted to convince the people of Israel that they should trust in God's promise rather than in what their eyes could see. They said that the people of Canaan may be large, but our God is not hindered in any way from fulfilling his covenant. Don't believe the report of the spies that say that the Canaanites are too large and our God is too small. Our God is not too small. He is more than capable of fulfilling the covenant. As a result of Caleb's faithfulness, God gave him a special inheritance in the midst of the land, and that is detailed in Joshua 14. We'll return to Caleb's example in just a bit. Joshua 15 records the allotment of the land to the tribe of Judah, the tribe from which would come Israel's kings and eventually Israel's Messiah, in fulfillment of the promise of Genesis 49, 8 through 12. Joshua 16 and 17 records the allotment of the land to the tribe of Ephraim. That's chapter 16, and to the half of the tribe of Manasseh that settled west of the Jordan. That's Joshua 17. 18 and 19 detail the allotment of the land to the remaining 7 tribes. After an initial description of the survey and the division of the land is then apportioned by lot to Benjamin, Simeon, Zebulun, Issachar, Asher, Naphtali, and Dan. Finally, last of all, an inheritance is given to Joshua at the very end of Joshua 19. The point to be made from this survey of these chapters is that God did what he said he was going to do. He has fulfilled his promise to Abraham. Now, some people claim that the promise to Abraham was not fulfilled in the conquest of the land and that it still awaits a future fulfillment. That's a view that has massive implications for eschatology, or the study of the end times. They say this because the land that is allotted in these chapters, if we notice carefully and read and have the Bible open to the maps and kind of flipping back and forth and tracing where the division is, they say this because these chapters, the inheritance in these chapters, they don't reach all the way down to the Nile River in the southwest. They don't reach all the way up to the Euphrates River in the northeast. A quick glance at your Bible maps will show this to be the case. The northernmost point of Israel's inheritance in these chapters seems to be Mount Hermon, which is still some 200 miles southwest of the Euphrates River. The southernmost point in this inheritance is still some 100 miles away from the nearest portion of the Nile River Delta. So they say, see, the promise to Abraham was not fulfilled in the conquest, so it must still be awaiting some future fulfillment. I think that view is problematic for about 40,000 different reasons, but I'm just going to give you 3 this morning. Number 1, I suspect that the geographic boundaries of the promised land given to Abraham in Genesis 15 are intended to be general, not specific. What section of the Euphrates River is to form its northern boundary? It doesn't say. What portion of the Nile River is to form its southern boundary? It doesn't say. No eastern boundary is ever mentioned. Now, I could be wrong, but the description of the land in Genesis 15 seems to have a generic quality about it, as opposed to the excruciatingly detailed description that's given in these chapters. So to force upon Genesis 15 an exactitude that is not intended is actually to do something illegitimate with the text. Second, I would note that in the time of Solomon, the kingdom of Israel actually did extend all the way up to the Euphrates River. We read about that in 1 Kings 4:24. But third, and most convincing, Joshua himself says that God's promise was fulfilled in the conquest of the land. I want you to turn with me to chapter 21, verses 43 to 45. At the end of the account of the division of the land, we find this summary. Thus the Lord gave to Israel all the land that he swore to give to their fathers. Seems pretty clear to me. And they took possession of it, and they settled there. And the Lord gave them rest on every side, just as he had sworn to their fathers. Not one of all their enemies had withstood them, for the Lord had given all their enemies into their hands. Not one word of all the good promises that the Lord had made to the house of Israel had failed. All came to pass. It seems clear to me that the author of Joshua considered the promise of Abraham in Genesis 15 fulfilled in the conquest of the land in the book of Joshua. In other words, we're not awaiting some future earthly geographical fulfillment of the land to a physical ethnic people of Israel. That's going to throw your view of the end times so far off the biblical track, you may never find your way back. All of God's promises now are located in Christ and in his church. So, the point of these 8 chapters is the faithfulness of God to his covenant. As the author of Joshua says, not one of all their enemies withstood them. Not one of all the good promises the Lord made to Israel has failed. All have come to pass. Here's what you can take away from that. Neither then will God allow your enemies to triumph over you, and neither will he allow any of his good promises that he has made to his church, that is to you, to fall to the ground. Not one of them. There will come a day when you will stand in peace in the land of promise, and you will say the same things that the author of Joshua says in Joshua 21:43. Not one promise has failed. Not one enemy has triumphed. God has done everything he said he would do. You can trust God to keep his covenant. You can trust him to fulfill his promise. If he was faithful with the shadow of the good things to come, he will for certain be faithful with the substance of the good things to come. Now, some of you need to hear this today because you feel like you're wandering aimlessly in the desert, like Israel during those 40 years. You feel as if your life were monotonous and meaningless, going nowhere and to no purpose. I assure you today that God knows you, that he remembers his covenant, and that he will bring you home. Not one of his promises will fail. You will inherit a land flowing with milk and honey, abounding in the blessing of God. Just keep following the pillar of cloud and fire, that is the Word and the Spirit. Stay faithful to God, and you will see the faithfulness of God. Some of you need to hear this today because you're battling enemies that, frankly, are stronger and greater than you. You're addicted to pornography or wine, or prescription meds, or food, or television, or unforgiveness, or the insatiable lust for the praise of men. You despair of ever being free of these sins. You despair of ever gaining victory. You need to know, you need to hear this morning that you will win the battle. God will not allow one of your enemies to triumph over you. There will come a day when you will find them dead at your feet, and you will stand in God's presence blameless with great joy. So keep fighting. Do not give up, and you will see the faithfulness of God. His covenant cannot fail. I want to return now to Joshua chapter 14. And I want to look at the courage of Caleb, who then stands in sharp contrast with the cowardice of Israel, as we will see momentarily. Let's read verses 6 to 15. Then the people of Judah came to Joshua at Gilgal, and Caleb the son of Jephunneh the Kenizzite said to him, "You know what the Lord said to Moses, the man of God, in Kadesh Barnea concerning you and me. I was 40 years old when Moses, the servant of the Lord, sent me from Kadesh Barnea to spy out the land, and I brought him word again as it was in my heart. But my brothers who went up with me made the heart of the people melt. Yet I wholly followed the Lord my God. And Moses swore on that day, saying, Surely the land on which your foot has trodden shall be an inheritance for you and for your children forever, because you have wholly followed the Lord my God. And now, behold, the Lord has kept me alive, just as he said, these 45 years since the time that the Lord spoke this word to Moses while Israel walked in the wilderness. And now, behold, I am this day 85 years old. I am still as strong today as I was in the day that Moses sent me. My strength is now as my strength was then, for war and for going and coming. So now, give me this hill country of which the Lord spoke on that day. For you heard on that day how the Anakim were there, with great fortified cities. It may be that the Lord will be with me, and I shall drive them out, just as the Lord said." Then Joshua blessed him, and he gave Hebron to Caleb, the son of Jephunneh, for an inheritance. Therefore Hebron became the inheritance of Caleb, the son of Jephunneh, the Kenizzite, to this day, because he wholly followed the Lord, the God of Israel. Now the name of Hebron formerly was Kiriath Arba. Arba was the greatest man of the Anakim, and the land had rest from war. Now, you're probably familiar with the story of Joshua and Caleb and the 12 spies at Kadesh Barnea in Numbers 13 and 14. You remember that 10 of those spies returned and said, the people are too big, their cities are too strong, our God is too weak, we should go back to Egypt. Joshua and Caleb, on the other hand, said, it matters not how big their people are, nor how strong their cities, we can take them, for God is with us. But the people believed the faithless report of the 10 rather than the faithful report of the 2. So God judged them and condemned them to wander for 40 years in the wilderness until all of that generation was dead, save 2. The Lord blessed Joshua and Caleb, and he promised that they would indeed enter the promised land and receive an inheritance among Israel. Joshua 14 is the fulfillment of that promise. Now, it's obvious that Caleb was a man of great faith. This is confirmed not only by Caleb's own testimony in verse 8. He says, I wholly followed the Lord my God. It was also confirmed by Moses, verse 9, because you have wholly followed the Lord my God. And it's confirmed by the author of Joshua in verse 14, because he wholly followed the Lord, the God of Israel. Do you sense a theme developing there? What I want to focus on this morning is that courage that this faith that Caleb had produced. Caleb knew from the depths of his heart that God was with him, and therefore it did not matter if he faced giants or fortresses. It was no more difficult, Caleb reasoned, for God to slay one giant or 10,000 giants, for God to bring down one fortified city or hundreds of them. God doesn't break a sweat. He expends no energy. He never gets tired. You don't have to pace omnipotence. You don't have to store up sovereignty. Caleb knew this. He had witnessed what God had done in Egypt, and he reasoned. Faith is reasonable. He reasoned that if God could part the Red Sea, then he could very well part the Jordan. If God could destroy the Egyptians, then he could destroy the Canaanites as well. Caleb saw those things and he reasoned with the reasoning of faith. It was unreasonable for the rest of Israel to say, well, I know what God did then, but he's not going to do it now. Caleb did not fear them when he was 40, and he does not fear them still now that he is 85. I mean, this is a feisty old man. You've got to admire his faith and his vigor. I'm as strong today as I was 45 years ago. I wasn't afraid of giants then. I'm not afraid of them now. Give me the hill country as an inheritance. I know there's still Anakim giants living there. But it may be that the Lord will be with me and I will drive them out. And I want you to notice the precise language that he uses. It may be that the Lord will be with me. He doesn't presume upon God. He hopes in God. There's a difference. I like what Davis says about this. Caleb's perhaps, or it may be, both preserves and recognizes the freedom of God. Caleb does not view Yahweh as his errand boy who must follow his orders, but as the free and sovereign Lord who does whatever he pleases. But because of Yahweh's promise, Caleb suspects that Yahweh will be pleased to drive out the enemy before him. He is confident, but not cocky. Biblical faith will always keep this tension. And indeed, God gave Caleb the victory. Joshua gave him the city of Hebron, which was as yet unconquered, but Caleb conquered it, as we read in the next chapter. Turn over with me to Joshua 15, verse 13. According to the commandment of the Lord to Joshua, he gave to Caleb, the son of Jephunneh, a portion among the people of Judah, Kiriath Arba, that is Hebron. Arba was the father of Anak. And Caleb drove out from there the three sons of Anak, Sheshai, Ahiman, and Talmai, the descendants of Anak. Caleb then turns his attention toward the city of Debir, and he captures it as well. Now, the reason why this narrative is stuck here where it seemingly doesn't belong, in the middle of this prolonged passage dealing with the division of the land among Israel, is that Caleb stands as a paradigm for the godly, faithful, courageous Israelite. And he stands in stark contrast to the rest of Israel, who began a pattern of faithlessness and compromise from the moment they received their inheritance. Throughout these chapters, we see hints, repeated hints, of trouble in Israel's future. The first instance appears in chapter 13, where we find this disconcerting indication of the eastern tribes of Israel failing to believe the Lord's promise and obey the Lord's command. 13:13. Yet the people of Israel did not drive out the Jeshurites or the Maacathites, but Jeshur and Maacath dwell in the land of Israel to this day. This kind of statement is going to recur frequently in these chapters, and they provide an ominous segue to the book of Judges, where these people of the land who were allowed to remain rise up to terrorize and to tempt the people of Israel. The next instance comes in chapter 15, after the allotment of Judah's inheritance, 1563. But the Jebusites, the inhabitants of Jerusalem, the people of Judah, could not drive out. So the Jebusites dwell with the people of Judah at Jerusalem to this day. Now, was that a problem with God's promise, or is that a problem with Judah's faithfulness? I hope you say the latter rather than the former. The Jebusites would not actually be driven out of Jerusalem until the time of David. It's recorded in 2 Samuel 5, some 400 years later. In chapters 16 and 17, we find the people of Israel innovating rather than obeying. God had commanded them to drive out completely the people of the land, lest they be corrupted by the pagan practices of these pagan Canaanites. But we read in Deuteronomy 7:16, here are the instructions. And you shall consume all the peoples that the Lord your God will give over to you. Your eyes shall not pity them, nor shall you serve their gods, for that would be a snare to you. There's the command. But the tribes of Ephraim and Manasseh reason that if they do that, if they totally destroy these Canaanites, that would be to destroy a source of cheap labor. So they came up with what they thought would be an acceptable compromise. 16:10. However, they did not drive out the Canaanites who lived in Gezer. So the Canaanites have lived in the midst of Ephraim to this day, but have been made to do forced labor. 17:13. Now when the people of Israel grew strong, they put the Canaanites to forced labor, but they did not utterly drive them out. And it turned out to be a terrible compromise, as the book of Judges so vividly illustrates. Listen, God does not call us to be creative. He calls us to be obedient. Finally, in chapter 18, we find Joshua scolding the tribes of Israel for failing to drive out the Canaanites from the land. So Joshua said to the people of Israel, "How long will you put off going in to take possession of the land which the Lord, the God of your fathers, has given you?" So there are hints of unbelief and disobedience scattered throughout these chapters detailing the allotment of the land. But the clearest example of Israel's faithfulness and compromise is found at the end of chapter 17. Look at verse 14. Then the people of Joseph, that is Ephraim and the half-tribe of Manasseh, spoke to Joshua, saying, "Why have you given me but one lot and one portion as an inheritance, although I am a numerous people, since all along the Lord has blessed me?" And Joshua said to them, "If you are a numerous people, then go up by yourselves to the forest, and there clear ground for yourselves in the land of the Perizzites and the Rephaim, since the hill country of Ephraim is too narrow for you." The people of Joshua said, "The hill country is not enough for us. Yet all the Canaanites who dwell in the plain have chariots of iron, both those in Beth Shean and its villages, and those in the valley of Jezreel." Then Joshua said to the house of Joseph, to Ephraim and Manasseh, "You are a numerous people and have great power. You shall not have one allotment only, but the hill country shall be yours. For though it is a forest, you shall clear it and possess it to the farthest borders. For you shall drive out the Canaanites, though they have chariots of iron, and though they are strong." So next to Caleb's stellar example of faith and courage, we find a rather sorry example of unbelief and cowardice. They grumble first about their inheritance. "It's too small. We're too numerous." But had not the Lord himself chosen their inheritance, revealing it to them by lot? Was this complaint not lodged against the Lord and his wisdom and his provision, not just against Joshua? At any rate, Joshua's first suggestion is that they should go and conquer the land that has actually been allotted to them. Clear the forest, drive out the people. But they complain that even then the hill country of Ephraim would not be enough for them. So I love this. So Joshua uses their own argument against them. I can kind of hear frustration in his voice at this point. Well, then spread out to the plains. "But the Canaanites who dwell in the plains have iron chariots." Well, that shouldn't be a problem for you, seeing how numerous you are. Joshua challenges them to act in faith. Clear the forest, dispossess the Perizzites and the Rephaim, that's another race of giants that dwelt in Canaan, and drive out the Canaanites with their iron chariots. What Joshua is saying to them is, do you believe God is with you or not? Do you believe God will fulfill his promise or not? What are you more afraid of, Canaanite chariots or the wrath of the Lord your God? The fundamental problem with the tribes of Joseph, like the rest of Israel, was unbelief. And this unbelief at root brought forth three bitter fruits. First, it brought forth compromise, like we saw with Ephraim and Manasseh. They thought they knew better than God. God said, destroy all the peoples, and they thought, well, we've got a better idea. We're going to make slaves of them so that they'll do our work for us. They underestimated God's wisdom. They overestimated their own strength. God said, destroy the Canaanites. Instead, they put them to forced labor. And true to God's word, they became a snare to the people of Israel. Just read the book of Judges. Secondly, it brought forth the fruit of complaining. They grumbled against God's provision. They said it was insufficient for their numbers. The truth of the situation was that God had given them more than enough real estate if they had but trusted him and driven out the people of the land. And finally, their unbelief brought forth the fruit of cowardice. But there are giants in the hill country, and there are iron chariots in the plains. How different is their attitude from that of Caleb, the giant slayer? Beloved, these chapters in Joshua are not boring. Parts of them are. But these chapters prove the faithfulness of God to his covenant and his people. They prove that his promises cannot fail. But they've also presented us, the church, with a choice. Who are we going to follow? Who are we going to model our church after? Are we going to be like Caleb, faithful and courageous, possessing the land by faith? Or are we going to be like the rest of Israel, fearful and compromised, cowering before God's enemies that he will slay with the breath of his mouth? These boring chapters of Joshua 13 to 21 are in reality a call for a radical and courageous faith in our faithful covenant-keeping God. And the question before us this morning is, how will we respond?